Forget the golden age of chivalry and the majestic marble statues of Rome. If you had a time machine, your first instinct wouldn't be awe, it would be to vomit. History wasn't just tough, it was a relentless 24/7 horror movie where the water was poison, the doctors were more dangerous than the diseases, and the sheer smell of a city could knock you unconscious. We like to romanticize the past, but the truth is, you wouldn't survive a single week in the world of your ancestors. Welcome to the side of history they didn't teach you in school. It was way, way worse than you think. In the modern world, we associate nature with fresh air. In the 18th century, nature was a cocktail of rotting meat, human excrement, and industrial bile. Imagine walking down the streets of London or Paris in the 1700s. There were no sewers. Instead, there were kennels, open ditches running down the center of the street filled with a stagnant black sludge of animal entrails and household waste. People lived in a world where tossing the contents of your chamber pot out the window wasn't a movie trope, it was the morning routine. The heat of the summer turned these cities into giant slow cookers for bacteria. The stench was so thick it was described as a physical weight. But the smell wasn't just outside, it was on the people. Bathing was considered a dangerous activity that opened your pores to miasma or bad air. King Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, who built the magnificent Palace of Versailles, reportedly only took 3 baths in his entire life. To mask the scent of rotting skin and sweat, the wealthy would drench themselves in heavy perfumes, creating a sickening mix of floral notes and unwashed bodies. Inside those grand palaces, things were even grimmer. Without indoor plumbing, hallways and staircases often served as makeshift toilets. The velvet curtains and ornate tapestries weren't just for decoration, they were breeding grounds for lice, bedbugs, and fleas. You weren't just living in history, you were being eaten by it. Every handshake was a gamble, and every meal was a brush with dysentery. This wasn't a world of elegance, it was a world of survival, where the very air you breathed was trying to kill you. If you think a trip to the dentist is scary today, imagine a world where the person cutting your hair was the same person tasked with amputating your leg. In the medieval and early modern eras, barber surgeons were the primary medical professionals. They didn't have medical degrees, they had sharp razors and strong arms. Surgery wasn't a sterile science, it was a frantic, bloody race against the clock. Since anesthesia hadn't been invented, the only way to help a patient survive the trauma of surgery was to do it as fast as humanly possible. A top-tier surgeon could remove a limb in under 2 minutes, while the patient was held down by 4 grown men, screaming in total consciousness. The logic behind medicine was even more terrifying than the tools. For centuries, the leading theory was humorism, the idea that your body was a vessel of 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you were sick, it meant your fluids were out of balance. The universal solution? Bloodletting. Doctors would use leeches or dirty scalpels to drain pints of blood from a weakened patient, effectively killing them faster in an attempt to save them. George Washington didn't just die of a throat infection. He died because his doctors drained nearly 40% of his blood in 24 hours, thinking they were cleansing his system. Then there were the medicines. Before the FDA existed, cures were often more toxic than the disease. For centuries, mercury, a heavy metal that causes brain damage and tooth loss, was the go-to treatment for everything from skin rashes to syphilis. People would rub mercury paste on their bodies or sit in mercury steam baths until their hair fell out and their gums turned black. If the mercury didn't kill you, the mummy powder might. During the Renaissance, Europeans were so obsessed with the healing powers of ancient Egypt that they ground up actual mummies into a fine powder and ate it, believing it could cure internal bleeding. You weren't just a patient, you were a walking experiment in a world where the cure was almost always a death sentence.
In the modern world, we suffer for fashion in high heels or tight jeans. But in the 18th and 19th centuries, fashion wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a literal suicide pact. The desire to look noble meant achieving a deathly pale complexion, which led to the widespread use of Venetian ceruse. This wasn't your standard foundation. It was a thick paste made of white lead and vinegar. Women would slather it over their faces, necks, and chests to hide blemishes and smallpox scars. Over time, the lead would seep into their pores, causing their skin to shrivel, their teeth to rot, and their hair to fall out. To fix the damage, they simply applied more lead, creating a toxic cycle that ended in madness, organ failure, or death. But the danger didn't stop at the skin. In the Victorian era, the color of the season was a vibrant electric hue called Scheele's green. It was stunning, regal, and absolutely saturated with arsenic. This deadly poison wasn't just in the dresses, it was in the wallpaper, the artificial flowers in women's hair, and even children's toys. A woman wearing a green gown was essentially a walking chemical weapon, shedding toxic dust with every step she took. Sweating in these dresses caused the arsenic to blister the skin, and many seamstresses, the ones actually making the clothes, died agonizing deaths from inhaling the particles while they sewed. Even the silhouette of the body was a death trap. The crinoline, those massive hoop skirts that made women look like they were floating on clouds, were incredibly flammable. In an age of open fireplaces and gas lamps, a single stray spark could turn a woman into a human torch in seconds. Because the skirts were so wide, women often didn't realize they had brushed against a grate until it was too late. Thousands of women burned to death in their own living rooms, trapped inside steel and fabric cages they couldn't escape. Meanwhile, men weren't safe either. The high collar trend involved starched, stiff neckbands so tight they could actually cut off the blood supply to the brain or cause a man to suffocate if he fell asleep in his chair. In history, looking your best often meant making sure you were ready for your own funeral. If you think modern processed food is bad, you haven't seen the Victorian kitchen. In the 1800s, before food safety laws existed, every meal was a game of Russian roulette. As people moved from farms to crowded cities, they became disconnected from their food sources, and unscrupulous merchants realized they could make a fortune by stretching their supplies with terrifying additives. The bread you ate for breakfast wasn't just flour and water. To make cheap, low-grade flour look like premium white bread, bakers would mix in alum, a metallic salt used in tanning leather, or even worse, ground-up chalk, plaster of Paris, and pipe clay. This didn't just lack nutrition, it caused chronic constipation and internal blockages that could be fatal, but the milk was even sinister. To hide the fact that milk had been watered down and was beginning to rot, milkmen would add borax to neutralize the smell and calves' brains to recreate the look of cream on top. Because there was no pasteurization, this milk was often a delivery system for bovine tuberculosis, killing thousands of children every year. Dinner was no safer. If you wanted to serve a colorful salad or a bright dessert, you were likely eating heavy metals. Copper sulfate was used to make pickles and canned vegetables look a vibrant, unnatural green. Red lead was added to cheese and cayenne pepper to give them a richer color. Even the candy sold to children was dyed with mercury and arsenic to make the sweets pop with bright yellows and reds. In cities like London and New York, pure food was a luxury the poor couldn't afford and the rich couldn't guarantee. You weren't just eating to survive, you were slowly poisoning yourself with every bite. The very kitchen that was supposed to nourish the family was, in reality, a laboratory of chemical warfare where the enemy was the man selling you your groceries. In the modern world, we protect children with car seats, safety gates, and specialized nutrition. But for most of history, childhood wasn't a time of innocence. It was a period of high-stakes survival where you were seen as nothing more than a small, inexpensive engine. During the Industrial Revolution, children as young as 4 or 5 were the backbone of the economy, precisely because their small stature allowed them to fit into places grown men couldn't. They were scavengers and piecers in textile mills, crawling under massive, thundering machinery while it was still running to pick up loose cotton or tie broken threads. One slip of a hand or a moment of exhaustion, and the gears would claim a limb or a life without the machine even slowing down. If you weren't in the mills, you were likely in the mines. Trappers were children who sat in total darkness for 12 hours a day, opening and closing ventilation doors to prevent explosions. The psychological toll of sitting in pitch-black silence surrounded by rats and the smell of coal dust was unimaginable, yet it was the daily reality for thousands. Others, known as climbing boys, were sold by their parents to chimney sweeps. These boys were forced to climb up narrow, suffocating flues clogged with soot. To encourage a frightened child to climb higher, masters would sometimes light small fires beneath them. These children suffered from stunted growth, chimney sweeps cancer caused by the soot, and the constant risk of getting stuck and suffocating behind a wall while the world went on outside. Even at home, the care children received was chilling. To keep babies quiet while their mothers worked long shifts, many were fed Godfrey's cordial, a popular patent medicine known as the mother's friend. Its primary ingredients? Opium and treacle. It worked perfectly. It kept the baby silent and lethargic, but it often led to accidental overdoses or starved infants who were too drugged to cry for food. In the 19th century, in some industrial cities, the mortality rate was so high that nearly half of all children died before their 5th birthday. Childhood wasn't a time of play. It was a brutal apprenticeship in a world that viewed you as a replaceable part in a much larger, colder machine. Today, we conquer the night with the flick of a switch, but for the vast majority of human history, sunset wasn't just the end of the day, it was the beginning of a primal, terrifying isolation. Before electricity, the world after dark was absolute. There were no streetlights, no glow from distant cities, and no safety. If you stepped outside your door in a 17th century city, you were stepping into a void where the only thing thicker than the darkness was the danger. The lighting people did have was often worse than the shadows. If you were poor, you used rushlights, dried reeds dipped in animal fat, tallow. They burned with a smoky, flickering light that smelled like a rotting carcass and lasted only a few minutes. If you were wealthy, you used beeswax candles, but even then the light was feeble. This constant dimness did strange things to the human psyche. People lived in a state of perpetual twilight melancholy. This is where the legends of ghosts, demons, and monsters truly lived. They weren't just stories, they were the only logical explanation for the strange sounds and moving shadows in a world that was 90% shadow. But the real monsters were the ones with heartbeats. Nighttime was the domain of the footpad and the cut purse. Without police forces and lighting, crime was effortless. A common tactic in London was for a thief to stretch a wire across a dark alley at neck height. They would wait for a victim to walk through, trip them or worse, and strip them of their clothes and coins before they even knew they were being robbed. If you cried for help, no one came. The night was a lawless zone where the only protection was a heavy club and a fast pair of legs. Even your own bed wasn't a sanctuary. Before the mid-19th century, people practiced segmented sleep. You didn't sleep for 8 hours. You slept for 4, woke up at midnight for 2 hours of the watch, a time spent praying, smoking, or talking in the dark, and then slept for another 4. During those midnight hours, the house was a death trap. Candles and oil lamps were the leading cause of house fires, and because houses were made of wood and straw, you could go from a deep sleep to being buried alive in a collapsing inferno in less than 3 minutes. The night wasn't for resting. It was a period of high-alert survival, where the sun's return was the true relief.
In the modern world, we watch true crime documentaries or horror movies to get a thrill. But for our ancestors, the horror was live, in person, and mandatory. Public executions were the Super Bowl of the pre-modern era. When a high-profile criminal was sentenced to death, the entire city would shut down. Schools closed, shops locked their doors, and thousands of people, men, women, and even children, jostled for the best view of the scaffold. This wasn't just about justice, it was a brutal, blood-soaked carnival designed to remind the masses exactly who held the power. The methods of execution were designed to be as prolonged and agonizing as possible. We often think of the clean snap of a Victorian gallows, but for most of history, death was a slow, messy performance. In France, before the invention of the guillotine, the most feared sentence was breaking on the wheel. The executioner would use a heavy iron bar to systematically shatter every major bone in the criminal's body while they were tied to a wagon wheel. The victim would then be left alive, their mangled limbs woven through the spokes, to die of shock and dehydration under the scorching sun as the crowd cheered and ate snacks. In England, the Triple Tree at Tyburn was a place of legendary suffering. For the crime of high treason, which could include something as simple as counterfeiting a coin, a man would be hanged, drawn, and quartered. This meant being hanged until almost dead, then cut down while still conscious to be disemboweled. The crowd would watch as the executioner burned the victim's organs in front of their fading eyes before finally chopping the body into 4 pieces to be displayed on spikes across the city. The atmosphere at these events wasn't somber, it was electric. Vendors sold hanging cakes, hot pies, and souvenir pamphlets detailing the criminal's supposed last words. People would pay extra for balcony seats in overlooking houses. There was a sickening level of intimacy with death. If the hanging didn't break the victim's neck immediately, their friends and family would often run forward to pull on their legs, hoping to end the agonizing strangulation faster. This was a society where the sight of a human being torn apart was as common as a Sunday brunch. The cruelty wasn't a bug in the system, it was the main attraction. In the 21st century, a pandemic means masks and social distancing. In the 14th and 17th centuries, a pandemic meant the literal end of the world. When the Black Death, or the Great Plague, rolled into a city, it didn't just bring disease, it brought a total collapse of human morality. The Yersinia pestis bacteria was a biological nightmare. You would wake up feeling fine, but by noon, agonizing boils called buboes would swell up in your groin and armpits, turning black and leaking pus and blood. By the second day, you were vomiting blood. By the third, you were a corpse. The speed of the kill was so fast that the living couldn't bury the dead fast enough. In cities like London and Florence, the dead carts rattled through the cobblestone streets at night, the drivers ringing bells and screaming the chilling refrain, "Bring out your dead!" Bodies were tossed into massive plague pits, giant holes in the ground where hundreds of corpses were layered like lasagna, covered in lime to accelerate decomposition. If you were unlucky enough to live near one, the smell of thousands of rotting bodies was your constant companion. But the most iconic image of this horror was the plague doctor. If you saw a man walking toward you wearing a long black coat and a mask with a giant bird-like beak, you knew your time was up. These masks weren't a fashion choice. The beak was stuffed with strong-smelling herbs like lavender and camphor, because doctors believed the plague was spread by miasma, bad smells. They looked like giant predatory birds, their glass eye inserts glowing in the candlelight as they poked at dying patients with long wooden canes to avoid touching them. The terror turned neighbor against neighbor. Parents abandoned their sick children, and priests refused to give last rites for fear of infection. The remedies were acts of desperation. People would sit in hot ovens, drink crushed emeralds, or whip themselves in the streets until they bled, hoping God would see their suffering and spare them from the boils. There was no science, no hope, and no mercy. You were trapped in a city-sized morgue, waiting for a bird-masked shadow to knock on your door and tell you it was your turn for the pit. We often picture the age of discovery through the lens of adventure, majestic ships cutting through blue waves toward uncharted horizons. But the reality of life aboard a 16th or 17th century vessel was a masterclass in human misery. A wooden ship was essentially a floating, leaking prison. For months at a time, hundreds of men were packed into the 'tween decks, a space with a ceiling so low you couldn't stand upright, shared with rats, livestock, and the overwhelming stench of the bilge, the stagnant, putrid water that collected at the bottom of the hull, filled with the ship's waste and the smell of rotting wood. the food was a psychological torture of its own. Fresh supplies usually rotted within the first 2 weeks. After that, the staple was hardtack, a biscuit baked so rock hard that sailors often had to soak it in beer or water just to keep from breaking their teeth. But the hardness wasn't the problem, the wildlife was. Hardtack was almost always infested with weevils and maggots. Experienced sailors learned to eat in the dark so they wouldn't have to see the black-headed worms crawling out of their food. When the biscuits ran out, they turned to salted beef that was so old and mahogany hard it could be carved into buttons or jewelry. In extreme cases, they would eat the leather rigging or the rats, which actually became a luxury item sold for pieces of silver. Then came the silent killer, scurvy. Without vitamin C, the human body literally begins to fall apart. First, your gums swell and turn black, then your teeth fall out. Old wounds and scars from years ago would mysteriously reopen, and bones that had broken and healed decades prior would snap apart again. Sailors would become so weak that their skin would bruise at the slightest touch, and they would drop dead while standing at the wheel. It wasn't uncommon for a ship to pull into port with 2/3 of its crew missing, replaced by a ghost ship of skeletal men who looked more like zombies than explorers. Life on deck was a brutal cycle of extreme weather and even more extreme discipline. For the slightest infraction, a sailor might be flogged, whipped with a cat of nine tails until the skin on his back was shredded to the bone, or worse, keel hauling, where a man was tied to a rope and dragged underneath the ship across the razor-sharp barnacles covering the hull. If the barnacles didn't slice him to death, the drowning would. The sea didn't care about your dreams of gold. It was a vast, salty graveyard where the only thing cheaper than the food was your life. We look at Rome and see marble columns, philosophy, and the birth of modern law. But if you were to walk through the streets of Rome at its peak, you wouldn't feel civilized, you would feel hunted. Rome was a society built on a foundation of absolute, unapologetic brutality. We celebrate the gladiators, but we forget that the Colosseum was essentially a high-budget slaughterhouse. It wasn't just about two warriors fighting. It was about damnatio ad bestias, execution by wild animals. Thousands of people were tossed into the arena unarmed, to be torn apart by starved lions and leopards, while 50,000 spectators cheered and placed bets on how long the screaming would last. During the 100-day festival opening the Colosseum, over 9,000 animals and thousands of humans were killed just for a change of pace. The civilized Roman lifestyle was a slow-motion chemical disaster. The Romans loved their infrastructure, especially their plumbing, but those famous pipes were made of lead. They also used sapa, a sweetener made by boiling grape juice in lead pots, which they added to almost everything they drank. This meant the Roman elite were suffering from chronic lead poisoning, leading to infertility, gout, and Roman madness. The very water and wine that fueled the empire were slowly rotting the brains of the people running it. Even the simple act of going to the bathroom was a nightmare. Rome had public toilets, which sounds advanced, but there was no toilet paper. Instead, there was the xylospongum, a sea sponge attached to a wooden stick. Here's the catch. It was a shared sponge. It sat in a bucket of salt water or vinegar, and every person used the same sponge to clean themselves before passing it to the next stranger. This made the public latrines a primary hub for spreading intestinal parasites and diseases. To make matters worse, the buildup of methane gas in the sewer systems below was so intense that flames could literally shoot up through the toilet holes, and occasionally the entire bathroom would explode while someone was sitting there. But the darkest secret was the social death. Rome was a slave society. At one point, nearly 1/3 of the population was enslaved. These weren't just workers, they were living tools with zero rights. A master could kill a slave for breaking a vase or just to show off at a dinner party. In Roman silver mines, slaves were forced to work in narrow, airless tunnels for weeks without seeing the sun until they dropped dead from exhaustion or lung failure. They were simply replaced. Rome didn't just build an empire, it ground human lives into the dust to make the mortar for its monuments.
In our world, hygiene is about removing germs. In the ancient and medieval worlds, hygiene was often about adding things that would make a modern person faint. If you think your morning routine is a chore, consider the Romans' secret weapon for a winning smile: human urine. The Romans discovered that the ammonia in urine acted as a natural bleaching agent. They didn't just use it to scrub their laundry, they used it as mouthwash. They believed it whitened the teeth and strengthened the gums. In fact, the trade of urine was so lucrative that the Emperor Vespasian actually placed a tax on it, giving birth to the famous phrase, pecunia non olet, money does not smell. Imagine your local pharmacy selling bottles of aged fermented pee so you could gargle before a hot date. That was the height of sophistication. But the obsession with toxic beauty only got weirder as history progressed. By the time we reached the Elizabethan era, the standards for cleanliness were purely visual. Queen Elizabeth I was famous for her porcelain white skin and her jet black teeth. Why black? Because sugar had become the ultimate status symbol. It was so expensive that only the ultra-rich could afford to rot their teeth with it. If your teeth weren't naturally rotting from sugar, you would use black soot to darken them, just to prove you were wealthy enough to afford the cavities. To clean those rotting teeth, people used dentifrice made of honey mixed with ground-up pumice stone, or, you guessed it, brick dust. They were essentially sandpapering their enamel off twice a day. And for the body, since water was feared as a carrier of disease, people used dry washing. They would rub their skin with white linen cloths, believing the cloth would absorb the dirt. They weren't actually clean, they were just moving the grease and dead skin around. The hair was a whole other ecosystem. The massive, towering wigs of the 18th century were held together with animal fat, lard. This made them a literal buffet for vermin. It wasn't uncommon for a noblewoman to wake up and find that a family of mice had chewed a hole into her wig overnight to nest in the lard. To prevent this, women would sleep with wire cages over their heads or keep flea traps, small ivory boxes with a piece of blood-soaked cloth inside, hanging around their necks to lure the bugs away from their skin. You weren't just a person, you were a walking, breathing habitat for the most disgusting creatures on Earth. If you think the smell of a modern dumpster is bad, it doesn't even register on the scale of an 18th century city. In places like London, New York, or Paris, the concept of zoning didn't exist. You could have a luxury townhouse sitting right next to a knacker's yard, a place where old dying horses were brought to be slaughtered and boiled down for glue. The air wasn't just air, it was a thick, greasy vapor of decomposing animal fat and copper-tasting blood. In the butcher districts, the streets were literally red. Because there were no drains, butchers would slaughter cattle right on the pavement. The blood, bile, and intestinal contents would flow into the gutters, mixing with the mud to create a slippery crimson sludge that stayed wet for days. Pedestrians had to wear pattens, wooden overshoes with iron rings, just to keep their feet from sinking into the slurry of organs and waste. On a hot day, the hum of millions of flies was so loud it could drown out a conversation. But the most vital and most disgusting job in the city belonged to the night soil men. Since indoor plumbing was a pipe dream, every house had a cesspit, a deep, brick-lined hole in the basement or backyard that collected every single thing that went down the privy. These pits weren't airtight, they would leak into the surrounding soil, contaminating the well water everyone drank. When the pit was full, the night soil men would arrive at midnight. These men descended into the dark, waist-deep in human waste, shoveling it out by hand into buckets. It was high-stakes work. The fumes, hydrogen sulfide and methane, were so concentrated that a single spark from a lantern could cause an explosion, or a man could simply pass out and drown in the filth. This night soil was then carted through the streets, dripping onto the cobblestones, to be sold to farmers as fertilizer for the very vegetables the city would eat the next day. It was a perfect, nauseating circle of life. You were eating the waste of your neighbors, filtered through a cabbage, while walking through the blood of a cow slaughtered on your doorstep. In the mid-1800s, hospitals weren't places of healing. They were houses of death. If you were wealthy, you paid a doctor to treat you at home. If you were poor, you went to the hospital, and you usually didn't come back. The mortality rate in some surgical wards was as high as 80%. This was the era of the Great Stink, not just in the streets, but in the halls of medicine. The biggest killer wasn't the surgery itself, it was hospitalism, a fancy Victorian word for the fact that surgeons were unintentionally murdering their patients. At the time, the concept of germs was laughed at. Doctors believed that a blood-stained surgical coat was a badge of honor. A surgeon would walk directly from an autopsy, where he had been elbow-deep in a rotting, diseased corpse, straight into a delivery room to help a woman give birth, or into an operating theater to open a man's chest. They didn't wash their hands, they didn't wash their instruments, they would often wipe their scalpels on their blood-encrusted aprons, or even hold the knife between their teeth while adjusting a bandage. Operating theaters were literal theaters. They were packed with students and curious onlookers in dirty street clothes, coughing and spitting into the sawdust on the floor. When a surgeon made an incision, he was introducing a cocktail of street filth and cadaver bacteria directly into the patient's bloodstream. Within days, the wound would begin to weep laudable pus. Doctors actually thought pus was a sign of healing, when in reality, it was the sound of the body losing its battle against sepsis. The wards were even worse. Beds were placed so close together that patients could reach out and touch the person dying of typhus next to them. Bedding was rarely changed between patients. If someone died of cholera in bed 4, the next person was tucked into the same damp, soiled sheets an hour later. The air was so thick with the smell of gangrene and excrement that nurses would walk around with handkerchiefs soaked in vinegar pressed to their faces. You went in with a broken leg and died 3 days later of ward fever, your blood turned into poison because the man trying to save you hadn't washed his hands in a week. In modern cities, we complain about smog, but in the mid-1800s, the air didn't just look dirty, it was a weapon. In places like London, Manchester, and Chicago, the fog wasn't a natural weather phenomenon. It was a thick yellow-black soup of coal smoke, sulfur dioxide, and industrial toxins known as a pea super. This smog was so dense that it could turn noon into midnight. You could hold your hand 6 inches from your face and see nothing. Walking through the city during one of these events was like breathing in ground glass. The soot was so heavy it would coat the back of your throat in minutes, turning your saliva black. People would literally lose their way on their own street and walk off the edge of dockyards into the freezing sewage-filled rivers. In 1873, a particularly bad fog settled over London for days. By the time it cleared, over 1,100 people were dead, their lungs simply unable to process the poison. But the horror wasn't just in the sky, it was in the water. As cities exploded in size, they outpaced any form of planning. In the tenements, thousands of people shared a single courtyard pump for their water. The problem? Those same courtyards were often right next to the communal cesspits. In 1854, a single pump on Broad Street in London became the center of a nightmare. People would drink a glass of water, and within hours they were suffering from the rice water stool, the hallmark of cholera. Cholera was a terrifying way to die. It didn't just make you sick, it dehydrated you so violently that your blood would thicken into a black sludge and your skin would turn a ghostly blue. Your muscles would cramp so hard that you would be twisted into agonizing shapes while still alive. You could lose 5 gallons of fluid in a single day. The Blue Death could take a healthy man at breakfast and have him in a coffin by dinner. And the worst part? Because the doctors still didn't believe in germs, they told people the disease was in the air, so people kept drinking from the same poisoned pumps, unknowingly swallowing the waste of their dying neighbors with every gulp.
We've been sold a version of the American frontier that looks like a rugged adventure, brave pioneers in covered wagons seeking a better life. But the Oregon Trail wasn't an adventure, it was a 2,000-mile-long graveyard. For every mile of the journey, there were an average of 10 graves. Most people didn't die from Wild West shootouts. They died from the grueling slow-motion collapse of the human body. The primary enemy was the ague, malaria, and dysentery. Imagine being stuck in a wooden wagon, baking in 100-degree heat while your insides are liquefying from contaminated water. There were no bathrooms, no privacy, and no stopping. If you were too sick to walk, you lay in the back of a jolting wagon, every bump on the rocky path feeling like a knife to the ribs. If you died, your family didn't have time for a funeral. They would bury you in a shallow grave right in the middle of the trail and then drive the wagons over you to flatten the earth, not out of disrespect, but to hide your scent from wolves and scavengers who would otherwise dig you up before the sun went down. Then there was the hunger. When supplies ran out, the romance of the West vanished. People ate their horses, then their dogs, and then the leather of their shoes. The infamous Donner Party is the ultimate cautionary tale. Trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains by an early blizzard, they were reduced to a state of primal desperation that is hard to fathom. They didn't just eat the dead, they had to decide which of their family members to consume first to keep the children alive. They boiled rugs to make a gelatinous glue just to have something in their stomachs. Even if you made it to the promised land, the survival didn't end. Life in a sod house on the plains meant living in a hut made of dirt and grass. It was a haven for rattlesnakes, which would drop from the ceiling into your bed at night, and flea plagues so intense you could scrape the insects off your skin with a knife. There was no wood for fire, so you burned buffalo chips, dried manure to cook your food, filling your tiny, unventilated home with the smoke of animal waste. The frontier didn't want you there. It spent every second of every day trying to turn you back into the dirt you were walking on. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the asylum was not a place of healing, it was a warehouse for the forgotten. The most infamous was London's St. Mary of Bethlehem, mercilessly nicknamed Bedlam. To the people of the time, mental illness wasn't a medical condition, it was a moral failing or a loss of humanity. If you were mad, you were treated less like a patient and more like a dangerous animal. The most chilling part of Bedlam wasn't just what happened inside, but who was watching. For the price of a penny, the general public could walk through the wards as a form of weekend entertainment. It was one of London's most popular tourist attractions, right alongside the Tower of London. Rich gentlemen and curious families would stroll past the cells, poking the inmates with sticks or laughing at their outbursts to see them perform. The more distressed the patient became, the better the show was. Inside the cells, the conditions were a living nightmare. Patients were often chained to the walls in freezing, unheated rooms for years at a time. They were left naked on straw that was rarely changed, soaking in their own waste. The treatments were designed to shock the system back into sanity. One popular method was the circulating swing, where a patient was strapped into a chair and spun at high speeds, up to 100 revolutions per minute, until blood flowed from her ears and nose, and she vomited uncontrollably. The theory was that the centrifugal force would rearrange the brain. If that didn't cure you, there was always the cold bath. Patients would be plunged into ice-cold water without warning and held under until they were on the verge of drowning. Others were subjected to blistering, where caustic chemicals were applied to the scalp to create painful sores, supposedly to draw out the inflammation from the brain. In this world, the mind was a mystery that doctors tried to solve with hammers and chains. You weren't a human being with a broken spirit. You were a spectacle, a monster in a cage, existing only for the amusement of a society that considered itself sane.
In the early 19th century, death didn't bring peace, it brought a market value. As medical schools in London and Edinburgh grew, the demand for subjects for anatomy classes skyrocketed. The law only allowed the bodies of executed criminals to be dissected, but there weren't enough hangings to satisfy the curiosity of thousands of medical students.
This created a gruesome new profession, the body snatchers, or more poetically, the resurrection men. If you were buried in a pauper's grave, you were essentially on a waiting list for the dissecting table. These men wouldn't dig up the whole grave. That took too much time. Instead, they would dig a small hole at the head of the coffin, break the wood with a crowbar, and hook a rope around the corpse's neck to haul it out like a fish. They would strip the body naked because stealing the clothes was a felony, theft, but stealing a dead body was legally ambiguous since a corpse didn't belong to anyone. The fear was so intense that it sparked a coffin war. The wealthy began buying mort safes, heavy iron cages bolted over the graves to keep the snatchers out. Others hired grave watchers to sit by the site with shotguns for weeks until the body was sufficiently rotted and useless to the doctors. But the resurrection men were clever. They would bribe the watchers or wait until they fell into a drunken stupor. Then came the darkest turn of all, Burke and Hare. In Edinburgh, these two men realized that waiting for people to die was inefficient. They decided to cut out the middleman. They began luring the poor and the marginalized into their lodging house, getting them drunk, and then suffocating them, a method that left no marks on the body, making it a prime specimen for the doctors. They murdered at least 16 people and sold them for cold, hard cash to Dr. Robert Knox, a leading anatomist who asked no questions about why the subjects looked so fresh. In this era, your value to society was often higher when you were a fresh corpse on a cold slab than when you were a living, breathing human being. When we think of ancient battles, we see Hollywood, ranks of shiny soldiers and heroic duels. But the reality of ancient warfare was a chaotic, wet, and sickeningly intimate experience. This wasn't combat at a distance. This was face-to-face slaughter. In the Bronze Age, there were no guns, no long-range artillery, and often no quick deaths. You didn't just fight an enemy, you smelled his breath, felt his blood spray onto your face, and heard the wet crunch of a bronze sword or a stone axe meeting human bone. The weapons were designed to crush and tear, not just slice. Bronze was a soft metal compared to steel. It would often bend or dull during a fight. This meant that instead of a clean cut, soldiers were subjected to blunt force trauma. Imagine being hit with a shield that weighed 20 pounds, followed by a spear thrust into your stomach. Because the spears were often barbed, they couldn't be pulled out. They had to be pushed all the way through the body or cut out with a dull knife. The aftermath was where the real horror began. If you survived the initial clash, you were left on a field of mud, horse manure, and thousands of screaming men. There were no medics, no ambulances, and no morphine. If you were gut shot, you died a slow, agonizing death from peritonitis over several days as your bowels leaked into your abdomen. If you had a broken limb, the standard treatment was to pull it straight while you were conscious and hope it didn't turn black with gangrene. But the most terrifying sound on an ancient battlefield wasn't the clashing of swords, it was the silence that followed. Once the fighting stopped, the scavengers arrived. These weren't just crows and wolves, they were the camp followers and enemy soldiers who would walk the field, stripping the wounded of their armor and clothes. If you were still alive but too injured to move, they wouldn't help you. They would slit your throat or bash your head in with a rock just to get to the silver ring on your finger or the boots on your feet. You went from being a hero of the state to a piece of meat on a discarded pile of waste in a matter of minutes. In the modern age, we view justice as a search for truth, but during the Inquisition, truth was secondary to purification. The goal wasn't to find out if you were innocent. The goal was to break your spirit until you admitted you were guilty. The logic was chillingly simple. The soul was more important than the body. Therefore, it was considered a mercy to destroy your physical form if it meant saving your eternal spirit from the fires of hell. The tools developed for this mercy were masterpieces of sadistic engineering. You've likely heard of the Iron Maiden, a sarcophagus lined with spikes, but the reality was often much simpler and more painful. There was the strappado, where a prisoner's hands were tied behind their back and they were hoisted into the air by a rope. The sudden drop would jerk their arms out of their sockets, leaving them dangling in agonizing suspension. If the confession didn't come, the executioners would add heavy iron weights to the victim's feet to pull the joints even further apart. Then there was the Judas cradle. The victim was lowered onto a wooden pyramid-shaped seat with the point slowly piercing the most sensitive parts of the body. There was no way to sleep, no way to rest, and no way to escape the constant piercing pressure. The executioners would keep the victim awake for days, whispering scripts of confessions into their ears. The terrifying paradox of the Inquisition was that innocence didn't exist. If you didn't confess, it was proof that the devil was giving you supernatural strength to resist. If you did confess, you were a confirmed heretic. The only difference was that a confession might grant you the mercy of being strangled before they burned you at the stake, rather than being burned alive. The crowd would gather for the auto da fe, act of faith, watching the flames as if it were a Sunday theater, while the air filled with the smell of roasting meat, a smell that the citizens of the time knew all too well. The Silk Road sounds like a shimmering golden highway of culture and luxury, but the merchants who actually walked it was a 2-year-long trek through a wasteland of corpses. This wasn't a single paved road, it was a shifting, lethal network of mountain passes and blistering deserts, where one wrong turn meant a slow death by dehydration or a fast death by a bandit's blade. The most feared stretch was the Taklamakan Desert. Its name literally translates to, "You go in, but you don't come out." Merchants had to navigate the singing sands, where shifting dunes created eerie booming noises that sounded like voices, often leading exhausted travelers to wander away from the caravan into the void. If the heat didn't kill you during the day, the temperature would drop to sub-zero at night, freezing men to death in their sleep. Water was more valuable than the silk they carried. When the wells dried up, travelers were forced to drink the blood of their camels or their own urine just to see the next sunrise. But the environment was only half the threat. The Silk Road was the world's first superhighway for disease. Along with the cinnamon and satin, merchants were unknowingly transporting the bubonic plague, smallpox, and anthrax. Every caravanserai, the roadside inns where travelers gathered, was a melting pot of bacteria from 3 different continents. You would huddle together for warmth with strangers from thousands of miles away, sharing food, lice, and deadly viruses. You might start your journey as a hopeful merchant looking for a fortune, only to end it as a nameless mummy, marking the path for the next man brave or foolish enough to try his luck. In the mid-19th century, the Great Stink wasn't just a catchy name, it was a societal collapse. As the Industrial Revolution drew millions of people into cities like London, the infrastructure simply vanished under the weight of the bodies. In the slums of East London or the tenements of New York, the concept of home was redefined as a single, damp room, often in a basement, shared by up to 12 people, including livestock. The walls of these rooms literally sweated with moisture, a mix of condensation and the seeping contents of nearby cesspits. Without windows or ventilation, the air became a stagnant soup of carbon dioxide, body odor, and the miasma of rotting waste. People didn't just live in these conditions, they worked in them. Families would spend 16 hours a day huddled around a single candle, sewing garments or assembling matchboxes, breathing in the fumes of their own waste. The water situation was a death sentence. In many slums, hundreds of families shared a single standpipe that was only turned on for 20 minutes a day. The water often came directly from the same rivers where the city's sewage was dumped. In London, the River Thames became so thick with human excrement, animal carcasses, and industrial chemicals that in the summer of 1858, the smell became a physical force. It was so powerful that Parliament had to be suspended because the politicians couldn't stop vomiting. They draped curtains soaked in chloride of lime over the windows to block the stench, but the great stink penetrated everything. For the children of the slums, the mortality rate was a coin flip. If you didn't die of the flux, dysentery, from the water, you likely died of the king's evil, tuberculosis, from the air. There was no grass, no sunlight, and no escape. The streets were narrow alleys filled with night soil that was rarely collected, creating a permanent layer of filth that kids played in barefoot. You weren't just poor, you were being biologically erased by the very city that claimed to be the center of the civilized world. We imagine Tudor banquets as glorious displays of roasted meats and fine wines. In reality, a 16th century kitchen was a humid, dangerous laboratory of slow-motion poisoning. The problem started with the cookware. Most households used pipkins, earthenware pots glazed with lead to make them waterproof. When acidic foods like vinegar, fruit, or wine were cooked in these pots, the lead leached directly into the meal. Over time, this led to colic, irritability, and mental decline. The very tools used to nourish a family were slowly rotting their nervous systems. The meat was another gamble. Without refrigeration, fresh was a relative term. To hide the taste of rot, cooks used overwhelming amounts of spices, pepper, cloves, and ginger, which is why Tudor food was famously over-seasoned. If the meat was truly high, starting to decompose, they would parboil it in a mixture of wine and vinegar to kill the surface bacteria before roasting it. It didn't always work. Food poisoning was so common it was barely even considered a medical event. It was just a regular part of the humors being out of balance. The heat of the kitchen was a killer. The spit boy, or turnbroach, had one of the worst jobs in history. Usually a small child, he would sit for hours, inches away from a roaring open fire, manually turning a heavy iron spit laden with meat. The heat was so intense it could blister the skin and cause permanent eye damage. These children were often covered in soot and grease, breathing in thick smoke for 12 to 14 hours a day. Then there was the sweetener. Sugar was the ultimate status symbol, but it was often processed using bone black, charred animal bones, and stored in damp warehouses where it became a breeding ground for mites. Even the bread was a hazard. In lean years, bakers would stretch the flour by mixing in chalk, ground up bones, or even sawdust to add weight. You weren't just eating dinner, you were consuming a cocktail of heavy metals, wood chips, and bacteria, all served on a trencher, a plate made of stale, 4-day-old bread that soaked up all the juices and was eventually thrown to the dogs or the poor, who would eat the soggy, lead-infused remains. In the Victorian era, a child's nursery was designed to be a sanctuary of innocence. In reality, it was a colorful death trap. The era's obsession with bright, vibrant colors led to the use of Scheele's green, a pigment made with arsenic. It was used in everything: toys, book covers, and most famously, wallpaper. When the damp London air hit the walls, the arsenic reacted with mold to release a tasteless, odorless gas. Children would breathe in these fumes all night, or worse, crawl along the floor and lick the colorful patterns, slowly succumbing to nursery wasting disease, which was actually just chronic arsenic poisoning. The danger didn't stop at the walls. Feeding a baby was a high-stakes gamble thanks to the invention of the mouth house or banjo bottle. These were glass bottles with long, narrow rubber tubes that allowed a baby to feed themselves. They were marketed as a convenience for busy mothers, but they were impossible to clean. Because the tubes were so thin, milk would sit inside and curdle, creating a thriving ecosystem of bacteria. Victorian doctors, still largely ignorant of germ theory, didn't understand why babies were dying of summer diarrhea or the thrush. These bottles were literally nicknamed murder bottles by those who realized the link, yet they remained popular for decades because they made parenting easier. Even the comforts of the nursery were lethal. To keep children quiet while parents worked or slept, many turned to Godfrey's cordial, also known as mother's friend. It was a thick syrup made of treacle, water, and a massive dose of opium. It was incredibly effective at stopping a baby from crying. It would put them into a deep, drug-induced stupor. Many children never woke up, their respiratory systems simply forgetting to breathe. If they did survive, they often grew up with severe developmental issues or a lifelong addiction. In the Victorian nursery, the very items meant to soothe and protect were the ones most likely to end a life before it truly began.
During the Industrial Revolution, coal was the black gold that powered the world, but it was harvested by men and children living in a literal underworld. A coal mine was a labyrinth of pitch-black tunnels, some so narrow that trappers, children as young as 4 or 5, had to sit in total darkness for 12 hours a day just to open and close ventilation doors. The air they breathed wasn't just dusty, it was choke damp, carbon dioxide, or the even more terrifying fire damp, methane. The canary in a coal mine wasn't a quaint saying. It was a desperate biological alarm. Because canaries have a higher metabolism and breathe more rapidly than humans, they would succumb to carbon monoxide poisoning long before the miners. If the bird stopped singing and fell off its perch, the miners had seconds to scramble for the surface before they too would simply fall over and die of invisible suffocation. But gas wasn't the only way the earth tried to kill you. The pillar and stall method of mining involved leaving columns of coal to hold up the ceiling. If the mine owners got greedy and robbed the pillars, shaved them down for extra coal, the immense weight of the mountain above would cause a squeeze. The wooden support beams would begin to groan and splinter with a sound like a gunshot, the final warning before thousands of tons of rock collapsed, burying entire shifts of men alive. Even if you survived the collapses and the explosions, you couldn't escape the black lung. The coal dust was so pervasive that it would settle deep in the lung tissue, eventually turning it into a hard, fibrous mass. Miners would cough up black fluid, literally pieces of their own lungs, for years after they left the mines. In the 19th century mining towns, it was rare to see an old man. The deep took your youth, your breath, and eventually your life to keep the furnaces of the surface world burning. We look at the ancient Greek gymnasium as a temple of physical perfection, but for the Greeks, gymnos literally meant naked, and their training was a brutal, dust-choked preparation for war. Athletes didn't wear sneakers or moisture-wicking gear, they coated their entire bodies in thick olive oil and fine sand. This served a dual purpose. It protected their skin from the sun and made them incredibly slippery, forcing wrestlers to develop a crushing grip strength that could snap a man's ribs or collarbone. The sports were often indistinguishable from homicide. The most popular event was pankration, a form of no-holds-barred fighting where the only rules were no biting and no eye gouging, and even those were often ignored. Combatants would fight until one was unconscious or dead. A common tactic was to break an opponent's fingers or toes one by one to force a submission. At the Olympic Games in 564 BCE, a fighter named Erychion of Phigalia was famously crowned the winner while dead. He had managed to snap his opponent's ankle just as he himself was being strangled to death. Hygiene in the gym was its own kind of horror. After a workout, athletes wouldn't shower with soap. Instead, they used a strigil, a curved metal scraping tool, to peel the gloios off their skin. Gloios was a gray, fermented sludge made of sweat, olive oil, dirt, and dead skin cells. But the Greeks didn't throw this waste away. It was considered a medicine packed with the essence of champions.
Physicians would collect this scrapings and sell them in jars to the public. People would rub this athlete grime onto their own bodies or even ingest it, believing it could cure inflammation, earaches, and muscle pain. In the 19th century mining towns, it was rare to see an old man. The deep took your youth, your breath, and eventually your life to keep the furnaces of the surface world burning. In the early 1900s, aviation wasn't a career, it was a suicide pact. The first airplanes were little more than kites with lawnmower engines, held together by piano wire, canvas, and a prayer. There were no cockpits, no seatbelts, and certainly no parachutes, because early flight theorists believed that carrying a parachute would make a pilot cowardly or more likely to abandon his expensive aircraft. The engines of the time, particularly the Gnome rotary engine, were masterpieces of mechanical self-destruction. In these engines, the entire cylinder block spun at high speeds around a stationary crankshaft. This created a massive gyroscopic effect that made the plane want to turn one way but resist turning the other. To make matters worse, these engines used castor oil as a lubricant. Because the engine was open, it would spray a constant fine mist of unburned castor oil directly into the pilot's face. Since castor oil is a powerful laxative, pilots suffered from chronic, violent diarrhea during long flights. Safety equipment consisted of a leather coat and a pair of goggles. The leather wasn't for style, it was because early fuel tanks were often positioned directly in front of the pilot. In a crash, the tank would rupture, drenching the pilot in gasoline before the engine ignited. Leather offered a few extra seconds of protection against the flash fire. If the fire didn't get you, the structural failure would. The wings were coated in dope, a highly flammable lacquer that made the fabric taut, but it also made the wings brittle. It wasn't uncommon for a wing to simply fold upward or shred into ribbons during a steep dive. Landing was the most dangerous part. There were no runways, just open fields. If you hit a hidden rabbit hole or a soft patch of mud, the plane would nose over, flipping the engine, which weighed several hundred pounds, directly onto the pilot's lap. Pilots of the Great War had a life expectancy measured in weeks, not years. They flew in freezing temperatures, breathing in oil fumes and gasoline, knowing that their chivalry of the air was really just a high-speed race to see which part of the machine would fail first.
We picture gladiators as muscle-bound titans fueled by steaks and wine. But modern forensic analysis of gladiator cemeteries, like the massive one found in Ephesus, reveals a reality that is far less heroic and much more beige. The world's most feared warriors were actually nicknamed hordeari, which literally translates to barley men. Their diet was almost entirely vegetarian, consisting of massive amounts of barley and beans. This wasn't because their masters were cheap. It was a strategic choice. A high-carb diet created a thick layer of subcutaneous fat over their muscles. In the arena, this fat acted as a natural shield. It allowed a gladiator to take a shallow, flashy sword cut that would bleed profusely for the crowd's amusement without damaging his vital organs or muscles. They were essentially walking human padding. To keep their bones from snapping under the pressure of combat, they didn't take calcium pills. Instead, they drank a ritualistic bone ash tonic. After every training session, they would stir the charred ashes of plants or bones into a cup of vinegar and water. It was a gritty, foul-tasting sludge that acted as a primitive calcium supplement. Analysis of their skeletons shows that their bone density was off the charts, but their joints were often riddled with the kind of wear and tear you'd see in a modern 80-year-old. The medical care for a gladiator was a mix of elite surgery and absolute filth. If a gladiator survived a bout with a gaping wound, the medicus might use ant bites to stitch the skin, holding a large ant to the wound until it bit down, then snapping off the body to leave the jaws as a staple.
To treat internal bruising, they would apply a poultice of fresh horse dung to the skin, believing the heat of the manure would draw out the toxins. You might have survived the trident of a retiarius, only to spend your recovery smelling like a stable while your bones fused back together from a diet of ash and porridge. In 1845, Sir John Franklin set off with two of the most advanced ships in the world, the HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, to find the Northwest Passage. They carried 3 years' worth of food and the latest Victorian technology. But the Arctic doesn't care about technology. Within 2 years, the ships were hopelessly nipped, frozen solid into a desert of shifting white ice. The horror of the Franklin expedition wasn't just the cold, it was a slow chemical betrayal. To feed the crew, the British Navy had commissioned thousands of tins of food. However, the canning process was new and rushed. The solder used to seal the tins was made of lead, which leached into the food. As the men sat in the dark, frozen hulls of their ships, they were slowly being poisoned. Lead poisoning causes paranoia, fatigue, and hallucinations. The leadership began to crumble as their brains literally failed them. As the lead weakened them, scurvy finished the job. Without vitamin C, the human body literally begins to come apart at the seams. Old scars from childhood would reopen into fresh wounds. Teeth would fall out of healthy gums. The connective tissue that holds the skeleton together would dissolve, making every movement an agony of grinding bone. By the time the survivors abandoned the ships to walk across the ice, they were ghosts, limping, bleeding, and insane. When rescuers finally found the remains of the expedition years later, they discovered a horror that Victorian England refused to believe. Skeletal remains showed clear pot polish and knife marks on the bones, telltale signs of cannibalism. The men hadn't just died of cold, they had hunted one another. In their final days, the pride of the British Navy were found huddled in lifeboats they were trying to drag across the land, filled not with survival gear, but with silver spoons and heavy books, useless trinkets of a civilization that had utterly failed them in the face of the frozen void. In the 18th and 19th centuries, public service was a concept that hadn't yet reached the fire department. If your house caught fire in London or New York, you didn't just call for help, you hoped you had paid your subscription. Firefighting was a private business run by insurance companies. To identify which houses were protected, insurance companies issued fire marks, heavy lead or iron plaques bolted to the front of the building. If a fire broke out, multiple private brigades would race to the scene. If they arrived and saw a fire mark that didn't belong to their company, they would simply pack up their hoses, cross their arms, and watch your life's work turn into ash. Sometimes they would even block other rival brigades from getting to the water source, leading to full-scale brawls in the street while the building behind them collapsed. The technology of the time was a nightmare of manual labor. The pumper engines were operated by long wooden bars called brakes. It took dozens of men pumping in rhythmic, back-breaking shifts to maintain enough pressure to throw a stream of water. If the fire was large, the heat was so intense that the wooden wheels of the fire engines would catch fire while they were still being used. And then there was the water problem. Before modern hydrants, firemen had to dig into the wooden water mains beneath the street. They would literally drill a hole into the pipe to create a wet well, and when they were finished, they would plug the hole with a wooden stopple. This is where we get the term fire plug. If the fire was in a wealthy neighborhood, they might use water. If it was in a slum and the insurance wasn't paid, the brigade might help by simply tearing down the neighboring houses with giant iron hooks to create a fire break, leaving the original family homeless and the rest of the street in ruins. In this era, the fire wasn't just a natural disaster, it was a high-stakes business negotiation where the penalty for losing was total destruction.
In the early 19th century, death didn't bring peace, it brought a market value. As medical schools in London and Edinburgh grew,
The demand for subjects for anatomy classes skyrocketed. The law only allowed the bodies of executed criminals to be dissected, but there weren't enough hangings to satisfy the curiosity of thousands of medical students. This created a gruesome new profession, the body snatchers, or more poetically, the resurrection men. If you were buried in a pauper's grave, you were essentially on a waiting list for the dissecting table. These men wouldn't dig up the whole grave. That took too much time. Instead, they would dig a small hole at the head of the coffin, break the wood with a crowbar, and hook a rope around the corpse's neck to haul it out like a fish. They would strip the body naked because stealing the clothes was a felony, theft, but stealing a dead body was legally ambiguous since a corpse didn't belong to anyone. The fear was so intense that it sparked a coffin war. The wealthy began buying mort safes, heavy iron cages bolted over the graves to keep the snatchers out. Others hired grave watchers to sit by the site with shotguns for weeks until the body was sufficiently rotted and useless to the doctors. But the resurrection men were clever. They would bribe the watchers or wait until they fell into a drunken stupor. Then came the darkest turn of all, Burke and Hare. In Edinburgh, these two men realized that waiting for people to die was inefficient. They decided to cut out the middleman. They began luring the poor and the marginalized into their lodging house, getting them drunk, and then suffocating them, a method that left no marks on the body, making it a prime specimen for the doctors. They murdered at least 16 people and sold them for cold, hard cash to Dr. Robert Knox, a leading anatomist who asked no questions about why the subjects looked so fresh. In this era, your value to society was often higher when you were a fresh corpse on a cold slab than when you were a living, breathing human being. When we think of ancient battles, we see Hollywood, ranks of shiny soldiers and heroic duels. But the reality of ancient warfare was a chaotic, wet, and sickeningly intimate experience. This wasn't combat at a distance. This was face-to-face slaughter. In the Bronze Age, there were no guns, no long-range artillery, and often no quick deaths. You didn't just fight an enemy, you smelled his breath, felt his blood spray onto your face, and heard the wet crunch of a bronze sword or a stone axe meeting human bone. The weapons were designed to crush and tear, not just slice. Bronze was a soft metal compared to steel. It would often bend or dull during a fight. This meant that instead of a clean cut, soldiers were subjected to blunt force trauma. Imagine being hit with a shield that weighed 20 pounds, followed by a spear thrust into your stomach. Because the spears were often barbed, they couldn't be pulled out. They had to be pushed all the way through the body or cut out with a dull knife. The aftermath was where the real horror began. If you survived the initial clash, you were left on a field of mud, horse manure, and thousands of screaming men. There were no medics, no ambulances, and no morphine. If you were gut-shot, you died a slow, agonizing death from peritonitis over several days as your bowels leaked into your abdomen. If you had a broken limb, the standard treatment was to pull it straight while you were conscious and hope it didn't turn black with gangrene. But the most terrifying sound on an ancient battlefield wasn't the clashing of swords, it was the silence that followed. Once the fighting stopped, the scavengers arrived. These weren't just crows and wolves, they were the camp followers and enemy soldiers who would walk the field, stripping the wounded of their armor and clothes. If you were still alive but too injured to move, they wouldn't help you. They would slit your throat or bash your head in with a rock just to get to the silver ring on your finger or the boots on your feet. You went from being a hero of the state to a piece of meat on a discarded pile of waste in a matter of minutes.
In the 19th century, to die for fashion was more than just a metaphor. The era's obsession with the perfect look led to a marketplace filled with toxic chemicals. The most notorious was Paris green, a vibrant pigment used in ball gowns, artificial flowers, and hairpieces. Its secret ingredient? Arsenic.
A single dress could contain as much as 900 grains of arsenic. As the wearer danced, the friction of the fabric would release a fine dust of poison that was absorbed through the pores or inhaled. While the wealthy women wearing the dresses suffered from skin ulcers and nausea, the seamstresses making them suffered far worse. They often died agonizing deaths, their lungs and hands ravaged by the green dust, their vomit turning the same brilliant shade of emerald as the fabric. The danger didn't stop at the dress. Beauty standards demanded a deathly pale complexion, leading women to use Venetian ceruse, a skin whitener made from lead. This cosmetic didn't just sit on the skin, it ate it. Over time, the lead caused the skin to turn gray, shrivel, and develop deep sores. To hide these sores, women would simply apply more lead, creating a vicious cycle of decay. Eventually, the lead poisoning caused teeth to fall out, hair to thin, and in many cases, total organ failure. Even the men weren't safe. The iconic high silk hat was often treated with mercury to create a smooth, shiny finish. Millers and hat makers who handled these materials for hours a day suffered from erethicism, mercury poisoning that caused tremors, extreme paranoia, and hallucinations.